This is Beyond the Big Screen Podcast with your host, Steve Guerra. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen Podcast, where we talk about great movies and stories so great they should be movies. Find show notes, links to subscribe, and leave Apple Podcast reviews by going to our website, beyondthebigscreen.com. And now, let's go beyond the big screen.
Welcome back to Beyond the Big Screen, where your two favorite detectives, Mustache Chris and Frank, are hiring some outside help to help us crack the case. We hired Darryl Cooper, yes, the Darryl Cooper, famously of the Martyr Made Podcast and the Unraveling Podcast with Jocko Willink. Me and Darryl have been online friends for years, and we've always kept in touch, and we finally got him to come on to the podcast. Now, Darryl, why don't you introduce yourself to the audience and explain a little bit your love of the first season of True Detective?
All right, yeah, so you pretty much covered it. I do two podcasts. One's the Unraveling with my buddy Jocko Willink. He's a retired Navy SEAL commander, and we kind of deal with, well, I guess we got a pretty open category as far as what we cover, but mostly we've been covering 20th century history, Cold War history, and contemporary political events and stuff. But my other one is the Martyr Made Podcast. It's a long form history podcast, 4, 5, 6, 7 hour long episodes, deep diving into topics, and been doing that for, I guess, since about 2016 or so. And it's how I get to spend my time now. I never really expected to be able to do it full time, but here I am. And so that's been nice. True Detective, I haven't met anybody who didn't like the first season of True Detective. I mean, maybe you could find some people who are really sensitive to dark substance matter, and they would get a little turned off by it for whatever reason. But for the most part, I think everybody likes it. Fukunaga did such an amazing job as the director. I don't know if you've seen the movie he did on Netflix, Beasts of No Nation. It's an incredible movie about a child soldier in basically Liberia or Sierra Leone. It doesn't say directly in the movie, but some West African civil war. Incredible war movie. And he's really talented. I really like that guy. After the first season, everybody knows it fell off a little bit. I thought second season was terrible. Third season was all right. And I kind of got the impression you have a band that comes out and their first album is just amazing. And then their second album comes out a year later and it's trash. And it's because they've had 10 years, they've had their whole lives to work on that first album, And maybe that's the case. I don't know. But, when I went into it, I had never read Lovecraft. I had some friends who had, and they kind of turned me on to some of the references and stuff. I had read Ligotti's Conspiracy of the Human Race. And so when Russ started getting on his rants, I kind of had an idea of where he was coming from. And, I think, you guys mind if I go on a little rant here for a second? Because this is really what fascinates me about the show in a lot of ways. I had some friends who were hardcore, horror, Lovecraft, Ligotti guys who were so excited about the show. And throughout the entire run, they were over the moon that someone was finally telling the story that they'd been reading for a long time and thinking about. And then it got to the end, the last episode, and they all hated it. They thought that it just totally lost the plot in terms of the horror themes that they were looking for from, Lovecraftian themes and stuff. And like I said, I'm not super familiar with Lovecraft, and I think that actually was a good thing for me because I really liked the way, that last scene, I think it's the very last scene maybe, when Marty is rolling Rust out in his wheelchair from the hospital, and he points up at the sky, and Russ sees the stars in the sky as the black is slowly consuming all of the light, and eventually it's all going to be black. And then Marty tells him that it used to be all black, and he thinks the light's winning. Those stars, the light's now starting to poke through. It's still mostly black, but that the light is gradually working. And so Russ, sort of Ligottian antinatalist philosophy that you guys talked about in the first episode is, you guys again talked about this a little bit, but you think about the emergence of human consciousness from nature, right? Assuming that, who knows, maybe we were all created in a garden in Mesopotamia 6,000 years ago and we're all from two parents. But let's just use the worldview that Rust would be using and say we evolved from nature, more or less like, a biology professor would explain it today. For this whole drama of life that is just, its entire function is to consume and break down the life energy of other life forms, integrate it into its own being in order to generate the energy necessary to maintain its pattern over time, to fight off entropy, basically, right? That's what life sort of is a rock is subject to entropy. A living creature resists and even pushes back against entropy. It grows into something more complex and more multifaceted. And then eventually that energy starts to run out, and then it breaks down into, it gives way to entropy. But for a brief time there, it's fighting it off. And that's really what life is. It's a brief resistance to and reversal of entropy. So this is going on for forever. The whole mechanism by which a life form resists entropy is, again, by taking the life force of another living being that's itself trying to resist entropy. And this all went on in the dark for billions of years. There was nobody here to witness it, except maybe God, but otherwise there was nobody here to witness it. And, you could even take that, if you want to go the extreme sort of interpretation of, whether a tree falling in the woods actually makes a sound. You could say like it was almost like it was not happening, or as if it was happening in a dream, but it was all taking place in the dark until one day, not very long ago, Homo sapiens been around 200,000 years or so. And we probably weren't conscious immediately. It's not like 200,000 years ago, a Homo erectus or whatever gave birth to a Homo sapiens and he came out of the womb talking like we're talking. This is something that gradually emerged over a long period of time as language developed and as our social complexity required our consciousness to emerge into what we have now. And when that started to happen, and who knows exactly when it happened, probably quite a ways back, because we have even Neanderthals. Actually, we have some certain archaeological finds and stuff that seem to indicate that they may have had some kind of an awareness of an afterlife. Like burying their dead with grave gear and things, tools and things like that. Which who knows? It could just be anything, but it's some indication. But certainly, by the time you get up to Homo sapiens, our species, you start to see people are aware of death. They're aware that something is lost. That something is lost when somebody, a member of the tribe goes away. And so since for billions of years, this horror show of just life consuming, eating, tearing apart life, incorporating it into its own being. And that's the whole driver of evolution. It's the whole way that life fights off entropy. Maybe like, who knows, maybe 40,000 years ago when we start seeing like a big elaboration of cave paintings and jewelry that people would make out of bones and shells and stuff, this big, elaboration of like human creativity. Maybe something changed in human consciousness just as recently as 40,000 years ago, that all of a sudden somebody woke up and looked around and saw what was going on around them and saw that just everything around them is tearing everything else apart. Every living thing is after the life force of every other living thing, and that they themselves have to kill and tear apart and do that in order to sustain themselves, right? And so it's a pretty recently emerged realization, I guess, that that from there people had to figure out how to deal with. You can talk about animal psychology if you want. I know people who have their dogs on Prozac, but human psychology is something I think we can all agree is qualitatively different in some way. And from then on, like, human beings had to get on in the world as creatures that for whatever reason, seem to require meaning in order to get out of bed in the morning. If you lose that, then, you're at serious risk of suicide or drug addiction, or just going off the rails and basically anesthetizing yourself one way or another and checking out of the human race if you lose all sense of meaning. So we require that, and we have to seek it out in a world where we know for an absolute fact, everybody we know is going to die, or we're going to die and they're going to lose us. Everything we ever create is eventually gonna, you can write the greatest novel in the history, but your language is eventually going to be forgotten by mankind, or that, all the copies of that book are going to disintegrate. And even if you get super lucky and you push on, like your country's going to eventually fall. Your civilization's going to fall. The Roman Empire fell. And eventually another asteroid or something is probably going to hit this place. And then you got to deal with that. And eventually the sun goes supernova. So that in the long term, for a creature that like really seeks a sense of permanence that it can, a species that is always seeking to kind of steal like a small piece of immortality, but knowing, always having to know that all the things that you use to prop up that sense of meaning are eventually going to fall apart and go away. And that's the predicament of humankind ever since, we woke up and looked around and took account of what was going on. And so, human culture to a large extent, I think, is the various means by which people have tried to explain that to themselves and deal with it and find a way to get up in the morning when they have all this knowledge that no other animal has to deal with. And I think True Detective on some level it's a battle between two approaches to that, right? You have, I'll get to the second part later, but like, you guys go ahead. I don't want to take up the entire time.
Well, I see Frank's probably realizing why me and Darryl get along so well, because I've done a lot of what Darryl just did in pretty much every podcast we just recorded.
To be fair, so am I. So you're not alone.
I start talking about 4,000 years ago in human history, but no, you nailed it.
Hey, go. Let's do this. Let's do this TV show review.
That's the core of the show, really, right? Is my opinion, and I said this on the first episode, is Russ's journey to finding meaning in life again. And at the end of the episode, when we touch on it, we'll probably have disagreements on exactly what that ending means. But he finds it at the end. He finds a reason to keep on going. He went into Carcosa wanting to, as he put it, die. He didn't straight out say that he wanted to die, but he implied it heavily that
pretty much did.
And this is going to be the end of it, right? Yeah. In episode 7, like, this is going to be the end of it. Finally he wasn't going to be a wimp anymore. It's like, I'm going to do this one last thing. I'm going to get this bad guy, and that's it. I'm out. I don't want to be part of this world anymore. And in the process, sorry, Frank.
We almost have to wonder if that was his way of rectifying exactly what Darryl's talking about. I mean, he knows that his legacy will disintegrate over time, but he still feels the need to have that legacy. And for him, it's about paying that debt, finishing what he started. And he feels like if he can do that, then he can at least go into the big nothing or whatever, with the sense of ease or satisfaction, or at least, something positive, or at least not negative.
I was going to say there's that scene in one of the early episodes where Marty asks him if he's a Christian because he has the crucifix on his wall, and he explains to him that, he uses it basically as a meditation device. He thinks about the night before the crucifixion in the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus is confronting what's about to happen to him, has the choice to opt out. I mean, it's something he had to take on willingly. And so willingly going forth to your own suffering and death like that. And he contemplates that. And, for a guy like Russ who sees the world the way he sees it, every day it has to be a conscious decision to fight off suicide. Every day has to be, knowing that there's nothing after this, that we're just on the threshing floor that is going to eventually get us all. And yet willingly, enduring that and taking up that cross, I guess you could say, and walking through the world anyway. And I thought that was, the thing is, like, that's as much as he may or may not have meant it that way. I mean, that is definitely a deeply Christian perspective in a lot of ways.
Well, there's a lot of filmmaking stylistic choices that were made that are very, I think, evoke Christian iconography. I'm saying that wrong. Iconography. Thank you. My syllable was wrong. But I mean, not just the blatant one of the cross and that one, iconic shot where he sits up out of focus and the cross is in focus, and then the focus shifts to a contemplative, very dark expression on his face, Rustin Cole. But I mean, jumping ahead a little bit, but in this episode, when he's in the bed with his hair down, staring out at the stars through the hospital window, I gotta think that's very purposeful, that he looks like a very, Western European version of a Christ-like figure in terms of the visuals of it. But you mentioned that, you spoke very eloquently about the larger, the kind of the macro picture of what people go through when they think about, the state of existence and the meaning of their own existence and how they process it. And I thought that was very well stated. On a micro level, I think in law enforcement, I think all cops go through that at a professional level, even if they don't realize the macro exists or think about it in those macro terms, but they think about it in terms of their profession. And what I mean is this: you come on the job, young and full of piss and vinegar, and you want to save the world, and you want to, kick bad guys' asses and take them to jail, and you want to be the hero and stuff. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I don't mean people have the wrong reasons for doing it, but you have this very idealistic approach to the profession, and you think you're going to make those changes. You're going to affect that seismic, difference that you're going to create with your actions, because you're going to save the right person and enough of them. And it doesn't take long to realize, you mentioned, we're all in a thresher. There's a different kind of thresher at work here, in that crime is not going away. People are not going to stop doing terrible things to each other and to themselves. And you learn pretty quickly, I'm not going to save the world. In fact, I'm not even going to save my city. It's humanly impossible for me to do so. And it doesn't mean I'm not heroic enough. It just means I can't do it. And 10 of me couldn't do it. And my 150 brothers and sisters were not going to be able to do it. Well, so that's that realization kind of that you were talking about, and the equivalent of it on a micro level. And the result that comes from that most of the time in good cops anyway is, okay, well, I'm going to take care of myself and my partners. I'm going to do the right thing, and I'm going to make a difference in these small little moments with these individual people whenever I can. And that's not going to change the big picture. It's not going to make crime go away. It's not going to make the world become suddenly a utopia, but it's going to make a difference in my life and in theirs in that small way. And that will be the purpose of my existence, on this planet as a police officer or a detective or whatever. And so I think they go through that same, grand, huge, philosophical, process that you described, but on a very micro level. And it almost as a self-defense mechanism.
Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like James Early's Key Battles of American History podcast and many other great shows. Go over to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. And here is a quick word from our sponsors.
What a beautiful one, though. It's a beautiful self-defense mechanism and a necessary one. Because I'm actually glad you brought that up, because that's the kind of thing I've wondered about in jobs like policemen for a long time. Like, I had a cousin who was a firefighter, and I would talk to him about his job, and 90% of his job, as was not rushing to 5-alarm high-rise fires to go up the ladder and hold that big trampoline for people to jump under. 90% of his job, was, a neighbor called because there's a strange smell coming from the apartment next door, and they find some bloated woman who's been there for 2 weeks, and you gotta go get this woman who's wedged between her toilet and her bathtub, and you gotta pull her out of that and carry her out as her skin's coming off in your hand. Now, you take any average normal person, if they ever encountered anything like that in their entire lives one time, they would be in therapy. They would be on pills. It would be a life-changing experience for them. This was the kind of thing that he dealt with all the time. And as police officers, a cop is pretty much always most of their human interactions outside of the force and their own family, are people having the worst day of their lives, right? Either people who have been engaged in some kind of crime or had one committed against them. Or
I've always described it as people having the worst day of their life, making the biggest mistake of their life, or the worst person.
Yeah. Right. And so you have to actually go back and be a normal person, right? When you clock out. And the ways that, I've always I'm fairly, libertarian, anti-government type when it comes to federal police, but I've always had a huge amount of respect for local cops, because, those are our people. Those are guys from our community who are policing our community. And, it's I don't think that we really, maybe internally, the police departments these days, modern police departments have a recognition of this and maybe ways of mitigating it. But I think as a society, we don't recognize the psychological sort of pitfalls, or I guess just it's not even pitfalls. It's built into a job like that. mean, even like there's a very
it's getting better internally. Like agencies have gotten better about it. I still think that you're right. It isn't as prevalent in terms of understanding it in society at large. And part of that, I think, is because, True Detective notwithstanding, a lot of our media glorifies and misrepresents police work. And so, it's hard for people to really truly imagine what it's like, because they're like, well, I see that in cop shows all the time, so it must be normal. So it must not have an impact on them. Or they're seeing things that aren't realistic, like NCIS and CSI and all those other, acronym related shows, so you're right.
Even like a much less traumatic, but and nonviolent version of it. When you said that the way that you overcome that, is overcome that realization that you're not going to change the world. You're not going to change anything, that the world is broken and it is the way it is. And you're, a lot of times, at least, a sort of cleanup crew is that you make the decision, yes, but I'm here with this person right now and I can help this person. And if I do it right, it'll, send their day, even this their day in one direction as opposed to another, but maybe even, their life in another direction. Who knows? Is that, I have family who are teachers, and they all went through a similar process with that, where they would get so attached to. You were a teacher?
My wife is a teacher.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. You know exactly what I'm going to say then, where you go in and you're like, I got this class full of kids, and, like whatever their background, I'm going to just, kids are going to come out of this class and out of this school and like change their lives. And it's like, the truth is, you're a factory floor manager, and the kids are going to come and they're going to go and come and go. And you get so attached to them, and they're going to go off and live their lives. And, the patterns by which they live their lives are not going to change all that much. But what you can do is, there are individual kids in each class that you're going to be able to pluck out of the fire and send off in a different direction. You got to really focus on those opportunities.
Yeah. Or you just have to conduct yourself in a way that you treat them all that way, because the reality is you don't know which kid is going to be the one that what you're doing, plucks them out of that or has that impact, and which one is going to respond to that and which one needs it the most. I mean, you certainly have the opportunity. And if Steve were here, he could talk about it too, because he teaches. He's a teacher. And giving extra attention and help to kids is something you can consciously do. But I actually think my wife makes a bigger difference, not by accident, but not with a shotgun, not a sniper rifle. I mean, I think that the way she conducts herself and treats all the kids with love and respect, and tries to teach them all and tries to make them feel good about who they are and become their best selves, because she never knows which ones it's having the biggest impact on, at least not, on a consistent basis. And occasionally one of them, because, I mean, like you said, the kids know they're part of a factory, right? And how many factory products remember the floor manager when they're out in the world? But every once in a while she'll get a note from, a high school or college aged or a kid who says, you might not remember me, but, and there'll be a testament to the difference that she made. And that's when she can be like, okay, well, I guess I am doing the right thing here. I just don't always see the results. And I think that, coming back around to the True Detective, really, I think Rust's like that in a way. I mean, I think he does look for the positive impact that he's having, and maybe he does it out of a sense of duty. But he is interested in making a difference in the cases that he works. Marty, I think he's got a different take on it early on. He's more of a go along to get along guy. He was a baseball player and a rodeo guy, and he was a jock, and so I'm not down talking jocks, but there's a different culture, at that age level when you're going through organized sports versus, I don't think Rust, maybe he played lacrosse. maybe he boxed or wrestled, but that's about, he wasn't a football player. He wasn't a baseball player. So,
he's not a joiner.
No, quite the contrary.
Although, that's interesting too, because there's that one really interesting scene, where he says, when he came out of his undercover duty and he was in rehab, that there was the passage from Philippians that he saw on a sign on the wall or something about, it's like an e pluribus unum type of thing. Right? I can't remember the exact quote, but it was a sort of from many parts, one body, from one body, many parts or something. And he said, I just wanted to stay part of the body, because if he didn't, he was just going to float off. And, you don't know what's out there when you float off. You think you do. Maybe it's, the best case scenario is that it's just darkness, but you don't know what's out there. And, Chris, let's get you in here, man. We've been just like, taking it up.
We've been playing tennis here. Let's make this court a 3-way court.
Yeah. Well, you guys were talking about just making differences in people's lives. And you mentioned something about a firefighter finding like a person that's been, in their bathtub for 2 weeks. And, kind of just, I guess, I've been getting a little personal on this show or whatever. Like, I didn't find my dad after 2 weeks, but I found him the day after. And much like Rust, right? And I talked about this on the first episode. It really like screwed me up. I never went to therapy or took any drugs or anything like that. And I find as I'm getting older, I work a very blue collar job. So a lot of the younger kids that I'm interacting with, and people in general, have also not had, let's just say, the easiest go in life. And I find that the difference that I try to make is I try to set an example for them, and then always like be there and give them advice a lot of my life. How to deal with some issues. Tell them exactly what, but it's like I've been through a lot of crazy crap in my life, and it's you can always just come and talk to me. And I think that's kind of why I relate to Rust in a lot of ways, in the sense of the path that he went down in terms of just, living his life and the way he looked at life. It's not explicitly said, but it's pretty much, you can gather that it was what happened to his daughter and then his marriage falling apart. And that's when he started going down this route in terms of philosophical pessimism and the way he looked at the world. He obviously didn't believe this at first, because otherwise, why did he become a cop? If he didn't think he could make a difference, then why would he become a cop?
Yeah, and why did he start a family in the first place? You
have to wonder if he was a little bit of a mild optimist prior to, his daughter's death and his disintegration of his marriage and everything. I mean, my theory is that he was like a fringe optimist, or at least a realist on the optimistic side of that spectrum. And then the grief and his inability to deal with it, knocked him down the spectrum until he crossed over the line into pessimism, and he found solace in that philosophy, and it kept him from experiencing the grief and having to deal with it. So, it became his defense mechanism. And the reason I think that is because of where the scene that you described, Darryl, at the end of, this episode, where that's an optimistic statement that he makes about the light winning, even though it doesn't look great. And so I think he kind of went rebounded back to almost to where he started. We just didn't see him in that state. We pick up the story when he's already deep into this pessimism.
I think one of the reasons that the first season of True Detective works so well is, it would have been really easy for a lesser writer. I think a lesser writer would have fallen into this trap, where clearly, the guy who wrote the series, I can't remember his name. Clearly he was, there you go. Clearly, it was he read Ligotti and these things, and he got very entranced by these ideas, and he wanted to put them on screen. And it would have been very tempting for a lesser writer to make Marty basically just a foil and a sounding board for Rust's philosophy, But Marty was much more than that. Marty was, for all his foibles, he was a sort of a worthy conversation partner a lot of the times. When they're sitting in the back of that traveling tent church, and Rust is going off about all these people and their, fake religion, why they do it or whatever. Marty gives it back to him in a way that actually shuts Rust up. And that happens several times throughout the show, where, it's not just that Rust sees the real truth of the world and Marty's over here just distracted by immediate events. And so he's just ignoring it and in denial about it. It's not like that. At the end of the day, as cool as Rust is, and we all love him when we watch that show, he's miserable. And by the end, he wants to kill himself, and that's the bottom line. If you take a person who, let's because people commit suicide every day. And, if he had committed suicide, in the arc of the show, it would have been some kind of, he would have been a kind of romantic figure. But in real life, when that happens, Thomas Ligotti himself, like he's always dealt with like severe depression off and on, that, suicidal, ideation, things like that. And so you can read something like Conspiracy of the Human Race, this big intellectual sort of, this big intellectual scaffolding that his depression is built on. He knows all this stuff. Therefore, it causes him depression and leads him to consider suicide and things. Maybe, but maybe he's depressed and he's suicidal and he's a really smart guy and he reads a lot. And so he's constructed this elaborate intellectual scaffolding to sort of rationalize his, and explain his feelings to himself. And so you take a guy like Rust and you say, what would like a happy ending be? Like, would a happy ending be, he really just kind of stops being how he is, and he finds a woman who makes him really happy, and he has a couple kids that are beautiful, and he raises them, and he's like a dad taking his kids to soccer, and it's great, and they grow up and they love him, and his community loves them and all that. That's a happy ending that in real life, that's what we all want, right? But I don't think anybody watching that show would have been satisfied if that's what happened to Russ. They don't want that for him. And I think people get locked into this mentality where no matter how miserable they are, they don't want that for themselves. Like they look at that kind of life and they would rather be complicated and miserable than be Marty, let's say without, the infidelity and everything. They would just rather be Russ than Marty. Right. Take the screwing up part away. There's a lot of people who would still choose to be Rust over Marty, even if
they think they would. They think they would.
Right. Until they're there. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
That's exactly it, right? As a side, well, it's not really a side note. It's unfortunately, a lot of people at their core are extreme narcissists. Right? Like they like the idea of them feeling like they're a lone wolf and nobody understands them and there's no one there to listen to talk to them, and they get caught up in wanting to be that person. And to a degree, and in a kind of perverse kind of way, they enjoy being like that. So I went through this stage, to be quite honest with you. But the reality is nobody wants that. They want people to talk to. They want people to be around there to, give them comfort when something goes wrong. When you really push these people and say like, oh, really? You're really that much of a lone wolf that, you won't open up to anybody and nobody's there to listen to you. And then you push back at them. I said, well, how many times have you been there for other people? In terms of, are you willing to do the work of actually opening up and talking to other people about what's going on in your life? And most people will be, well, no, like they're supposed to come to me. It's like, no. That's not how it works. You have to be willing to open up yourself. And then they stop and then they pause. And I've had these conversations with people, and then sometimes they pause and they go, well, actually, you have a point there, Chris. And then other people they get pissed off. And then maybe in a couple of months, they think back what I said, because I know they're good. I know they're going to think about it because they've sat and paused. They never really thought about it. They never really looked at it that way, And I always push a big thing to people too. I said that we're all, especially in the modern age, we're all so narcissistic. Like, we all think we're so unique and special in a lot of ways.
Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors.
The narcissistic personality structure is just like any other personality structure, is a product of how you're raised, right? And we pretty much are a society that manufactures narcissists. I mean, it's almost built to do that, where, the basic psychological explanation for narcissism, and whatever, psychology can be pretty hit and miss, obviously. But I think this makes a lot of sense, at least, is you raise a child and fill them with these ideas that they are the center of the world. They're so special. There's nobody like them. They're unique. There's nobody quite who can, really, but deprive them of what the thing that they really need most, which is the devoted attention of their parents, the devoted attention of the people around them and the love of their, specifically their parents. And if you deprive them of that and put this idea in their head that they're so special and unique, there develops this ambivalence in the personality where they feel like I'm unique, I'm special, I'm all these things. And yet there's this gigantic hole in me that I can't fill because I was never able to get the thing that I needed most as my personality was forming. And that just describes even good parents, right? Even good parents. I read a book about the Columbine kids. I read a bunch of books about them, actually. I was fascinated by that for a while. And their parents, especially Dylan's parents, the one who was, thought of as kind of the follower kid, they're good parents. They're great parents by all appearances. And I don't mean that there's some like dark underside, like, people aren't seeing like this sort of, like it's not like that. They were great parents and they were trying hard. And, they ate dinner with their kids every night. They asked them questions about school. They were involved. They were understand all these things. And yet they were both the parents are both very, very much involved in their own lives, doing their own things. And the kids were, Dylan was kind of left to himself, to the point where he could have, these things in his room, cutting videos, talking about these things, and the parents were totally ignorant of it. And so, it's like an example of that, where even good parents are manufacturing narcissists. It's just how, it's how we raise kids these days. I was going to say too,
if I could interject real quick, if you throw in the internet now, which, in 2001 Columbine, I think.
99.
Was it 99? Okay.
Yeah.
Which incidentally completely revamped the way we in law enforcement respond to active shooter situations.
Yeah.
It was a huge catalyst for a change in training. But 1999 versus today, look at the impact of, and the reach of social media and the internet in general. And I think that is just that's a force multiplier in a huge way, to what you're talking about.
It especially to the extent that it abstracts and sort of, breaks apart organic human relationships. And it has the effect of making almost everybody, it seems like these days, especially after COVID. And there's actually like research coming out about this now that backs this up. It's not just anecdotal experience, that it's kind of making everybody, just like at least mildly autistic, or what we, not maybe in the medical sense of that term, but what people normally mean by that, where, socially anxious, they feel like they can't quite, function. When people are paying attention to them, they don't, people who, like a huge number of people who are like at least mildly agoraphobic now, they don't like to leave their house. A lot of people who, we find out after COVID, who they miss everybody wearing the masks all the time. I mean, that's kind of crazy to somebody like me, but like but I understand it on some level, like where you go out there and they like just the depersonalization of a mask, where they can kind of go out and they don't have to be seen, And that is, you have to think about the fact that, like, even if you go back to the 1950s, right, there is a reason that we mythologize the 1950s. They were already mythologized in the 50s by, like, I think American Graffiti came out in 73. And that was Lucas's sort of, he sort of started the modern 50s mythology type way of looking at things. And then the next year, in fact, I think 74 or 75 is when Happy Days started. And so already by then, after the 60s had got through just sort of throwing all of our social structures and ideas about family and society, just throwing them all into a blender. People come out the other side and they look back about 15 years ago into the 1950s. And, what was the society that they saw there? You hadn't really seen like a lot of white flight out of the cities yet. And so, if you were to go to New York or Chicago, and any of these cities, you still pretty much had like the Irish neighborhood over there and the Italian neighborhood over there. And most people, when they were old men, would be sitting on their porch in the evenings having a beer with kids they went to kindergarten. And for all of humanity's history, people were deeply embedded in a social context that helped them define who they were and what was important to them. And, we evolved to need these things, to need that social connection. What the rules were. And so, you see it. People who get completely disconnected from others, they need to get reconnected, or else they tend to go off the rails pretty quickly. You start to fall apart, even biochemically, you start to fall apart. And so it's almost as if evolution is triggering a response where it's like, okay, if you're not useful to the group at all anymore, then you got to get out of the way, like stop eating up resources or something. And so that's how we were from like 200,000 years ago until 1965. And all of a sudden, nobody knows anybody. You don't know your neighbors. People see their parents once a year for Christmas if they're good kids, And that's kind of just, we've all just been completely ripped out of that social context in the space of a couple decades, you know? And the idea that that's not going to have just tremendous psychological and social consequences. I mean, just incalculable things that we, because we're inside it, cannot even really wrap our minds around how massive the changes must be.
It's a cultural earthquake.
You take, you know, a condition that in the past would have been considered just, you know, the worst catastrophe. Like the Greeks, they wouldn't execute you, they would exile you. And it was because exile was execution, basically. It was like, it was at least as bad in a lot of ways. And all of a sudden everybody's in exile, you know, effectively in a way. And even if you know, they have access to other people, they don't know how to connect with them. And that is something that, you know, I really think that like our generation, like one of our great tasks is to sort of document and explain that experience, because people who really came of age, like long before all those things started to break down, and everybody from now on, they're never going to really be able to understand what happened.
Well, it's what you mentioned. Well, what you mentioned is somebody like, say, Russ going through his depression was coming up nowadays, right? Like he could go on YouTube and find how his depression is so unique in comparison to everybody else. And, you know, let's be honest, to a degree, his depression is unique because he's so extremely intelligent in comparison to pretty much everybody else around him. But really at the core of it, his depression is not unique. He needs the same things that everybody else needs.
I mean, it's one of the biggest uses of therapy. And this is a problem that narcissists and intelligent people always run into when they try to go to therapy. They go to therapy and they're like, you know, whatever. Like I've read some Freud, I've read Jung, like everything that my psychiatrist or whatever is telling me, I know what they're going to say. Like I can predict it before it even comes out there. And yeah, that might totally be true. But one of the biggest effects that therapy has on people who stick with it is realizing that your problems and your feelings and your depression or whatever it is, your counselor just talked to 10 people suffering from the same thing. And after you leave the office, he's going to talk to 10 more people who are experiencing the same thing. It is not like this big, you see this in like Dostoevsky and like the Underground, Notes from the Underground, for example, where, you know, even his, or I would even say like, this is a big theme in Dostoevsky's personal life where, you know, one of the things about Dostoevsky is just a degenerate gambler. I mean, to the point of like selling his wife's jewelry, you know, his wife having to hire herself out as a cleaning lady and stuff so she could pay the rent because he was just losing all their rent money and food money on gambling. Degenerate gambler. And if you read his early work, he's still sort of in this denial state, this underground state where, you know, yes, I'm a degenerate gambler, but I'm the most degenerate gambler. And it's just this tragic Shakespearean flaw of my personality. And why can't I escape it? And eventually, after he goes through his exile period and the whole mock execution in the middle of his career, comes out and he writes Notes from the Underground. And from that book on, every book he wrote after that is totally stripped of all those illusions. And he knows that like, oh no, wait, like I'm just a degenerate gambler. Like that's all. Like, just like everybody else at the roulette table when I go there, or the guys I have to step over because they're passed out, like outside. I'm just like them. Like, that's all. And I'm smart and I've read books so I can romanticize this and mythologize my suffering. But at the end of the day, I'm just some dude who is like making his wife go to work to pay our rent because I'm losing all our money gambling. Like, that's all. And you see that in Crime and Punishment, when Raskolnikov goes into a bar and he meets the father of the young prostitute that he befriends, he's an alcoholic. And he gives this big long speech to Raskolnikov about, his life and about how, you know, his wife had to send their young teenage daughter out on the streets to prostitute herself in order to be able to put food on the table and buy medicine because they were sick. And he, sees this, you know, he sees her gets sent out, he's drunk, and she comes back and she just sort of like is quiet, and she goes and crawls under a cover and in the corner and lies facing the wall. And her mother comes and, you know, kisses her feet at first and then just curls up on her and holds her, and he just lays there drunk. And the whole scene is like, it's this image of a guy who's like, there's nothing romantic about this man suffering. There's nothing poetic about it. There's nothing. He's just you know, pardon my, I don't know if I can curse on here, but like, that's it. And you need to stop being and so, you know, one thing I was going to say too is it's really I have to imagine that this was intentional. It's very interesting that they named McConaughey's character Rust, right? Because rust is, it's corrosion, right? It's something being eaten away and corroded, and the whole landscape. They chose southern Louisiana there. That whole landscape, if you zoom in on like the map of the soul of the boot, that is Louisiana, got all these, like, it just breaks up into all these little islands and stuff. And that's because the ocean is taking that land back. It's eating away at the land, and eventually all that. So that's why, Katrina was such a disaster in New Orleans, for example. All that's going to be taken back eventually. And it kind of goes to that last scene we were talking about, where they're under the stars, looking at the stars. Is you can look at this as like there's this world, and nature, or just chaos, let's say, is just taking everything back. It's eating away at everything at the edges, and it's eventually going to consume everything. And what you see here, these people who are in this worship service or anything else, these are just people they're just desperate people who are trying to hold on to something as the inevitable is coming for them and eating away. And,
let me interject something real quick before you do that, if you would.
Oh yeah. We've been talking as if everybody's seen this entire show. And
that's our premise, is that
okay.
you have this is for people who have seen it, not people who are wondering if they should see it. We answered that question 3 minutes in. Yes, go watch it, then come back. But you were talking about we talked about how narcissism is so prevalent and being essentially, bred into us, or raised into us, I guess. But then you throw in the connectivity of the internet, which allows you to see that, there's a universality to your experience, right? You're not unique. At least not everything about you is unique. Your suffering is the same as your neighbor's suffering, and so forth. There's a dissonance there, right? I mean, if you're brought up to think, and I think Russ, when you were talking about that, and that this thought that I just said occurred to me, in a flash, it was that scene with Russ during his interview with Papania and Gilbo, where he looks up at the stars and he's like, "What? Me? This is all for me? I'm so special," and he goes through that thing, and that's almost an existential crisis that I think people probably have to deal with pretty frequently.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, it's a lot of these things that people do well to not dwell on too much. Because it's dangerous, it is dangerous. And there are people that who do it almost like as a religious, there've been monks and saints who they spend their lives contemplating these things. But most people, like, you got to get to work and be productive today. And then you got to get home and you got to deal with your kids and you got to be a good dad and like whatever. You can't be over here thinking about.
And then you're too tired to think about it.
Yeah. And that's probably by design too. I was talking earlier about just consciousness emerging out of nature, and a big part of Rust's, that scene in the car is great, where he's kind of like explaining his philosophical pessimism, and he kind of tells the Ligotti version of it with regard to human consciousness. It's just, that, we were evolving like every other animal. Mammals maybe developed some rudimentary emotions due to, long-term pair bonding and having to care for their young for long periods of time. And so maybe there's, I certainly, I think anybody who has dogs and cats you can understand that there's a certain level of animal emotion in a mammal, that you don't see in a reptile, say. And so that's starting to develop. But then you get to humanity, and sometime in the last 200,000 years, we started to learn to speak, which meant we started to learn how to speak to ourselves, which meant that eventually we started to develop concepts like I or me, which, that don't exist for other animals. Like the whole, like once you say the word or just have the concept in your mind, everything changes at that point, right? Because now the world is a much more dangerous place than it was before. It's, you have something, I mean, shoot, there's an old Hindu scripture, one of the oldest Hindu scriptures, the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, where it starts out like right at the beginning. It's talking about the creation of the universe, and the way the universe was created was there was just sort of the depends on how it's translated, but it'll say like the self, but really it's just being. being. There was just being. And then one day being had a thought, and that thought was I. And so that's sort of like consciousness awakening, right? And so the first thing that happens when being has the concept of I is it gets afraid because it thinks, well, what if something happens to me? And then he had a second thought, which was, oh, nothing can happen to me because there's nobody else here. And that led to the second feeling that he had, which was loneliness and desire. Let's say desire. I wish somebody else were here. And so the two immediate consequences of having a self, of just awakening and having a self concept, are fear and desire. And those are the two, like the twin, pillars that humanity has to sort of navigate through that other animals don't really have to deal with. Animals have impulses. A lion's desire to have a gazelle is that's not desire. That's an animal impulse. And, like people will, it's why the eating the fruit in the Garden of Eden, was the fall of mankind, it was simultaneously like it was the thing that started us down the path toward developing modern consciousness and all of the suffering and fear and everything else that journey entails, right? It's dooming us to those things. Like, when it says like, if you eat of that, you shall surely die. Is it like, okay, so did like nothing die before that? It's like, maybe in the mythology version, but you can take it out of the mythology version and say, well, no, like, you got a herd of buffalo and a buffalo gets picked off by, hunters and brought back for meat. Yeah, that buffalo, that organism dies, but, it's not, there's no self-concept to kill, and there's nobody to miss that buffalo or anything like that. Like, it's really just part of a larger tapestry of life, and it's one little bit of it that got kind of plucked out and will be replaced. And that death, in the sense we think of it, that's a human thing. That's something that we go through. And if you take that idea of the development of consciousness even further, I think that, because again, you have to think like, we didn't come out 200,000 years ago, experiencing and looking at and thinking about the world the way we modern people think about it, right? Just probably a function of language. Language probably started with one or two words, maybe like a command or a warning, and then it elaborated from there. And as language elaborated, we, the ways we were able to structure our consciousness and experience the world began to elaborate as well. And, there's a theory that consciousness as we think of it, right? Having this sort of internal theater of the mind where you can simulate, potential responses to future events, and you can recall past memories and bring them up to put that experience to use. This whole inner self that we experience, that, again, presumably you go back 200,000 years, that didn't exist at all, that it started to emerge over time, but that even as late as like 10,000 years ago, that most people were not really in that state, right? And the reason for that is because they had no reason to be. Like, consciousness in this model, the kind of consciousness we think of it, is a sort of stress response, right? Because if you're guided by instinct, you're an animal or you're a primitive, hominid or something, then you can get through your life without ever having to consult your consciousness to solve a problem. I mean, your instinct tells you what to do. If you're a reptile or even like a mammal, you have instincts that tell you what your priorities are, how to deal with situations, etc. And that's it. And you don't have any cause to be thrown back on yourself and deep in your own consciousness. There's just no cause for it. Humans, our great thing is that we can cooperate extremely well, coordinate our activities, and we can actually get to a problem and say, well, instinct doesn't have anything for me for this problem. And so I have to figure out how to deal with this now. And so when that happens, there's a stress response that, back in the day would be a thing that would happen every once in a while when one of these situations that instinct didn't cover came up and you had to figure out how to deal with it. And that once we moved out of our tribal formations, our hunter-gatherer tribal formations, which are more or less natural, kin-based, human situation, and we started moving into like towns and cities and stuff, right? Like your instinct, if you're just talking about like a primitive tribe, instinct is usually enough to let you know how you're supposed to relate to your father and your mother and your brothers and sisters and everything else. Like it's built into us. You understand on an instinctual level that your father is higher than you are in the hierarchy and that he deserves a certain amount of, just all that stuff's built in. You move into a town and city which is not that long ago. And all of a sudden, people are confronted with situations that instinct has not prepared them for all the time. Like in fact, pretty much all the time. You have to deal with people who are not kin. You have to negotiate, like, okay, where am I with regard to this person? What's our relation? All of the technical problems, all the things that are out there that, once you move into an urban culture, the instinct just, it almost becomes like problematic, right? Because like it's the thing that drives you off the rails, like causes you to do things that are antisocial in a lot of ways. And so once that happened, this thing that used to be like almost a tool in the toolbox, right? Consciousness, where I can sort of conjure up this theater of the mind and draw on past experiences. Now I can solve this problem. Or if I have this confrontation coming up, I can model different scenarios in my mind and figure out how I'm going to respond to them, all that. That once we moved into an urban environment, an instinct was not much help to us on our daily basis. And we had to, that thing that used to be like an occasional tool in our toolbox just flipped on all the time. And now we're all in this stress response, this mode that was never really meant to be a permanent structure that you woke up with and had all day and went to bed with or anything like. It was never meant to be that. It was meant to help you solve specific problems that now in our modern environment, it is that. And so that's what kind of Rust is talking about when he says that human consciousness is almost a kind of disease, or it was like, and again, this goes back to Dostoevsky too, in Notes from the Underground, where he says that, he says men only need like so much consciousness to get by and have a happy life, probably about half what they have right now. And that once you get past a certain point where your consciousness is overdeveloped, it becomes debilitating. It becomes a kind of disease and a source of suffering and stress. And you see with Rust and Marty, like two poles, right? Marty is just sort of totally locked into the moment, driven by impulse and like just sort of like very much like, in the moment. And you mentioned him being a jock earlier. There's a stereotype, right? Of like, the jock who is, sort of dumb and shallow, but really socially graceful, really good at operating in the world, physically graceful, all these things. And then you have like the nerd who is sort of more sensitive, but very socially awkward, but, smarter, deeper, sort of intellectually, but very just totally useless out in the social world or physical world or anything, sports, whatever. And, most stereotypes have a little something to them. And that one, it's not necessarily totally fair, to jocks. I know a lot of smart and smart is probably the part of it that doesn't apply as much, but the depth part does, where a lot of times it looks like the jock is shallow, but what it really is, they both are living the same amount of life. It's just that the jock's life is out here. It's out here in the world. And that's where they put their emphasis, right? Yeah. And it's where, maybe he has like 10% of his world is out there, or 90% of his world is out there. 10% of it's in his internal mind where he spends his time, because he doesn't encounter the problems that the nerd encounters when he goes out into the world, where he goes and he asks a girl out on a date, or he decides he wants to do something and he just does it because he's good at it. He's a jock. He's a socially graceful jock. And so he goes out into the world and things just sort of doors open for him and things tend to go his way. And so that's where his attention remains. It's when you run into an obstacle that you don't know how to overcome, that you're thrown back on yourself and driven deeper into yourself. And you develop that sensitivity that the nerd has. And so the nerd, 90% of his world is in here. It's inside his head. And 10% of his world is out there in the world. And, those are two, again, Marty and Rust are like two archetypes of that. Rust has no life out in the outer world other than like his cases that he's working or something. But other than that, he doesn't have any, there's absolutely nothing in the world that he could lose that would really cost him anything, whereas Marty, he's not self-reflective, and all of his life is lived out in the world in front of him.
Well, it's interesting that you talk about consciousness, but at the same time, that hardwired physiological response that we've had for hundreds of thousands of years, that kicks in for reasons of threats that are not physical. And so we're actually double cursed in a way in the scenario that you're describing.
That's such a good point.
We're dealing with the physiological flight or fight response and all of the autonomic issues that are going on in our bodies, and the parasympathetic and sympathetic and flux and all of this, while at the same time we're being pushed back into, being overly wrought with our own consciousness. So
that's such a great point.
Describing all that, the dilemma is even, it's multifaceted in a way, but,
you just got me excited. That's all. It's just, if you take that idea seriously, that consciousness originally developed almost as a sort of stress response to help us deal with specific situations that we confront, where we needed to be able to model different scenarios as we made a plan to overcome the situation. The extreme version of that is like you're saying here, like nowadays, the overdeveloped version of that is a person who just all they can think about is things that might go wrong. All they can think about is the catastrophes that might befall them, no matter what and the thing is, that's what consciousness is supposed to do, right? Consciousness is supposed to let you think, okay, what can go wrong as I approach this situation? Okay, well, how can I, and so it's supposed to be alerting you to things that can go wrong, but you can be backed into a corner due to, a lot of different reasons, whether it's trauma or whether it's, just, the sort of corner that you've backed yourself into in your daily life, where that's all you can think about. It's all you can think about. And you're constantly in that heightened state of reactivity and stress, that fight or flight mode, basically, that is the sort of the symptom of an overdeveloped consciousness.
Yeah. You're reacting to, listening to a podcast or seeing a tweet the same way you would a physical threat that, you would have faced in out in the world, in the real world. And it's which creates for the consciousness a form of dissonance, because I know that tweet's not going to hurt me, but somehow it does. And so you get into this cyclical, sort of downward spiral that people deal with. And
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors.
Well, then your mind takes the second step and it starts being like, okay, I'm stressed out and angry because I saw a news story this morning that really pissed me off, right? Involving people I will never meet who live
who I can't impact at all.
Yeah. Who live in the Middle East and we'll never know each other's exists or anything, but I'm experiencing anger or stress over it as if somebody in my community had this problem or whatever. But then your mind says, well, that doesn't make any sense. This is not the reason I'm angry, but I feel angry. And all of a sudden, your wife does this thing that normally you wouldn't quite really care about, but today it's really annoying. And you say, oh, well, here's the reason I'm angry. It happens all the time,
Well, you guys kind of perfectly, when people talk about the Garden of Eden, most people think the interpretations God was keeping them from gaining knowledge. You guys perfectly described why God didn't want to eat from that tree, because of self-consciousness and the I, and this entire conversation about Rust's neuroticism, really, at the end of the day, right? He's a very neurotic individual. He's depressive. This is exactly why that's the meaning of the story. That's the way I've always interpreted it. Was before we ate that tree, it was just, we knew what to do. It's okay, God, and this is what he wants us to do. There was no self-consciousness, right? But then we decided, hey, you know what? I think I know better, right? So then we ate from that tree, and then we developed the ego, we developed our personality, the I, and then we realized very quickly that us individually, we're not going to be able to solve we're not going to be able to solve these problems, right? That's the way I've always interpreted that story.
And the way it's kind of been interpreted over the years, right, is that God was angry that we did that. And that's a sort of human way of understanding that experience. But what it really is that no, once you go down that road, you are separating yourself. In the garden, God walked with Adam in the cool of the evening, just like he walks in the cool of the evening with all of his other creatures who are just being guided by, the circuitry that God, guided by God's law at all times. All animals are guided by God's law at all times. Right? They are completely in touch with it. That's what nature is. And then humans, you develop the ego and you start to split off in your own direction. And just, it's not even a matter exactly of being cast out, even though it's obviously framed that way in the story. But it's just a matter of, you could reframe it as those are kids running away from home. And
you have to leave the garden. They've already left the moment that knowledge occurs.
Yeah. Right.
It's a psychological casting out, not a physical one, even though it's framed that way, for mythological purposes, right? I mean,
I think the way we're talking about the development of consciousness too, I think the Bible story is fascinating from this perspective, right? Where, like my favorite book to think about and study is the book of Job. And I really feel like it is sort of the hinge point of the whole biblical story, whether you're a Jew or a Christian. Like, I think if you're, if you're a Jew and so all you have is, what Christians call the Old Testament, then the books of the Bible are reordered from what Christians are used to. They were reordered a bit in the Old Testament by Christians. And the speech that God gives to Job after all his suffering is complete, that's the last time God speaks in the Hebrew Bible. Like, that's his final message to mankind as far as they're concerned. And so it's pivotally important in that sense. But then even from a Christian standpoint, I think the book of Job is like the turning point of the entire story. And what I mean by that is, it's interesting to read the book of Job in a way that, again, is not encouraged in any of our churches. And it's not something, again, you want to get too stuck on for that reason, but it's a worthy exercise, I think, is, the traditional way of reading the book of Job, the dogmatic way of reading it is God is good. End of story. He's the good guy. And so we need to read this story in a way and figure out how this story can be interpreted that makes him the good guy. Even if you read the book of Job, and by every just law of human relations, every moral and ethical law that God ever laid down, he's clearly the bad guy here, right? Job did nothing wrong. It goes out of its way at the beginning to say this is a blameless man, to the point that God is bragging to the devil about this, the loyalty and blamelessness of my servant Job. And the fact that the devil was just passing through. He didn't come up to God and figure out a way, like, how am I going to tempt God into, torturing this poor innocent man? The devil was actually just passing through the throne room, and God said, hey, what do you think of my servant Job down here? What do you think of that? He's just blameless, totally loyal. And it was only then that the devil said, well, are you sure? And so it was almost like a doubt crept into God's mind, right? About Job's loyalty. And if you look at the entirety of the Hebrew Bible, for the most part, you have God who is, presumably omniscient, omnipotent, infinite, everything, right? He is the universe. He's all power. He's all everything, which means there's, like when God wanted to create the entire universe, all he had to do was just like have a thought, let there be light. And then all of a sudden light appeared. And so, in other words, anything he wanted to do, kind of like in an extreme version of like that jocks experience out in the social world, anything he wanted to do, he just did it. There was never any occasion whatsoever where he would actually run up against an obstacle. The whole idea of an obstacle for God is an oxymoron, right? It's just his will is the exact same thing as something happening. It's like they're the same thing. And so if consciousness is something that develops when we encounter obstacles and get thrown back on ourselves, that's what makes us have to like consider who we are and what we're doing and why and everything. That from the beginning of the universe, God never encountered one of those situations. And so all of a sudden, he has this whole world that's basically running on autopilot. All the animals, all the solar systems, are turning, and everything is kind of just going exactly how he designed it, totally predictable. He can tell you where every atom in the universe is going to be 100 years from now. You know it for a fact. He can, it's all operating according to his law. And then all of a sudden you have these two little guys in the garden who are, they're part of that world. And there's a big part of them that is tied into that. But they can be disobedient, right? They actually do something that he did not plan for them to do. He did not want them to do. And you think, well, that's why they were cursed. This is, this was a terrible sin on their part. And it's like, okay, maybe, but go forward a little bit in the book of Genesis. And the nation of Israel is spawned from whom? It's spawned from the patriarch Jacob, right? Abraham begat Isaac, Isaac begat Jacob. And Jacob was on his way to see his brother Esau one time and confront him. And in the nighttime, God came to him, and Jacob fought or wrestled with God. And he wrestled with him all night. And it says God could not overcome him. So that by the morning, Jacob was still holding on, and God had to tell him, let me go. For dawn approaches. And Jacob says, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And so he says, okay, I bless you. And hereby, and afterwards, I hereby change your name to Israel. For you have struggled with God and overcome, right? So the name Israel, the name of God's people, the people he chooses, the chosen people's name is the people who struggle against God, right? And so you think about it and be like, okay, this is like the worst sin is that Adam and Eve rebelled in the garden and all that. And yet he names his chosen people basically after that quality, after their capacity to like resist. And it totally makes sense in a lot of ways, right? Like if you had a zoo and then all of a sudden you realize that like one of these animals, like there's somebody home, like it can, it can think on its own, and like that there's a kernel, there's a place in every human being that even God can't access. That there's a certain kernel at the depth of our will because of the way he made us that God cannot, he can smite us. He can, burn up the world and flood it if he wants to. But what he can't do, he can do whatever he wants to us physically and all these things. But there's that small room in the heart that even God, he can't barge in. He has to be invited. And it's because, you can't force somebody to love you, right? If God wanted just worship, he was getting that from the angels. He was getting that from the whole universe in a way, right? But all of a sudden there's this creature, humans, and this is the first and only being in the whole history of the universe that he can actually have a relationship with. And he can have a relationship with them specifically because they can say no to him and say, I don't want a relationship. That's the only thing. The animals can't do that. The humans can do it. And so you can actually have a relationship with this creature. And so he becomes obsessed with this creature as like the center of his whole creation. And who wouldn't, right? And so he names Israel, the people who struggle against God. But then what happens is they do struggle against him and rebel against him throughout the Old Testament again and again. And he goes insane. He like his rants as you get into like Ezekiel and stuff are not just like, because thou hast, fallen into unrighteousness, I shall. No, it's like these violent rants of a betrayed husband a lot of the times, of somebody who is violently emotional about the betrayal of and infidelity of his wife. Like that's the most common language that, in these things in the Bible. And so, the fact that these people can rebel against him is exactly why they're so important to him. If they couldn't do that, then they would just be like any other dumb animal and have their place in nature. And so he needs that capacity from them. But the fact that they do it drives him absolutely insane every time it happens, and he punishes them terribly. And so you get up to the book of Job, and this has just happened again and again. I mean, the Israelites have had their town sacked, their women and children killed. They've been taken off into captivity and slavery, all as a result of these rebellions and God's vengeance against them for doing these things. And all of a sudden you get to the book of Job, and Job is this guy who, it's very important that at the beginning of the story, because, you'll talk to people about it and they'll say, well, no, the point of the story is that all men have sin. And so Job had sin. And therefore, like, the book goes out of its way to say that's not the case. It says that Job was a blameless man, right? Spotless in the eyes of God. And so no human is like that except for Christ. But for the sake of the story, they're making it clear that in this case it was, right? Because it's a myth. And so God puts him through, he kills his family. He gives him terrible diseases. I mean, he just tortures this man for no reason, just to satisfy his own doubt as to his loyalty. That's why he tortures him, right? What would normally happen in a situation like that? What had happened again and again and again throughout the Old Testament, every time he did something similar to the Israelites, put them through hell, because he doubted their loyalty. What would normally happen is Job would just fall on his face and be like, I'm so sorry, whatever I did, I'm so sorry. Like, you're the best and I will never do it again. Just please stop. But Job didn't do that for 30 chapters. Like, once Job's friends show up, they're giving him all the normal explanations that people would give for that. Like, oh, well, yeah, your family's dead, but they must have had some secret sin. They must have done something, or just giving them all of the sort of rationalizations for why God would allow something like this or do something like this. And Job does not back down 1 inch. I mean, like, it's so fascinating to really go back and read it, because you hear about like the patience of Job, that cliche, and Job is not patient in that book. Job is calling God to the carpet to be like, wait a second, you said that if I did this and that and stayed away from this and that X, Y, and Z would happen. That's what you promised. And that's what I did. So what is going on here? You need to come down here and explain yourself to me. And he uses like terms that are reminiscent of like a courtroom. He's making an accusation in court and he wants you to come and explain yourself. He's bringing charges against even the Satan is not, in that story is called the adversary, and the adversary in the context of the Old Testament is like a prosecuting attorney. bringing a lawsuit against somebody, basically. And so Job doesn't back down. And because Job doesn't back down, God's in this situation where he's sort of caught out. And like, again, if Job had just groveled, he would have been like, that's right, and moved on. But Job never did that. And so God's kind of caught out, like, wait a second, like, I am kind of contradicting everything I said. I am treating this person unjustly as I myself have defined justice forever, right? And I think it can be read as like bringing an awareness to God. Yeah, there's a story in Exodus when the Israelites are wandering through the desert and they're all starving. They come out of Egypt because they trusted Moses. They went out there, but now they're in the desert. They're just wandering around and they're starving to death, right? And you're talking men, women, and children. This isn't an army. This is just a bunch of men, women, and children out there. And they're now starving to death and there's no water and they're out in the middle of the desert. And they start to say, like, man, like, why did you even bring us out of Egypt? This is terrible. Like, we're scared. And so God slaughters them for it, just for like complaining that they're starving to death. He just kills like thousands of them. And, you know, you have to like think about it in terms of like God is like, God doesn't know what it's like to watch his child starve to death. He doesn't know what it's like to suffer. He's never suffered. He's never suffered before. He's never really been able to, you know, experience that, to know what it is that these people are going through down here who are watching their children starve to death, and that they're expressing their fear and terror of the situation that they find themselves in. And he slaughters them for it. And so you get up to the book of Job, and I think Job is sort of that moment from a Christian perspective where God was forced to confront. It was the first time that he was ever made to understand what suffering is and what he had been putting people through, just by virtue of the way the world itself is designed. It has to be designed, right? It has to be designed this way. And this is kind of what God's speech at the end is, you know, he doesn't give Job a big moral lecture. He just shows him this vision in the whirlwind of lions tearing apart gazelles and war horses like stamping and snorting, wanting to go into battle, and, you know, whole just solar systems being created. It's just, he's giving him a vision of like how the universe works. And the universe has to work in a way like there would be no change, no evolution, no progress, and humans wouldn't be here at all if that process we were talking about at the beginning, as just things getting torn apart and eaten and consumed and all that. If none of that happened, then we would all still be single-celled organisms, if that, right? Everything since then has required like the world to be the universe to be as it is. So it can't be any other way. And yet to us, you know, change is experienced as suffering, you know, change is experienced as loss, and fear of dramatic change, you know, it permeates our whole life. And I think that the book of Job, it's very interesting to read that book in those terms and think that, you know, God told Job, and again, in the last speech he ever gave to humanity, if you read it according to the Hebrew Bible, and even in the ordering of the Christian Bible, it's the last time he speaks for himself. You know, there are prophets who speak for him after that, but it's the last time he speaks for himself. So it really is like his last direct message to humanity. And if you read the Christian story in that light, you can say that God, when finally confronted with what it meant, what humans had been going through this whole time, you know, that he had not been aware of before, what they had been going through this whole time, he had to tell them, like, look, I can't change the way the universe works. If the universe didn't work, there'd be no movement, there'd be no change, there'd be no evolution. You would not be here. Nothing would be here. This is how it has to be. What I can do is I can come down and experience that with you, you know? And so he came down in the form of Christ. And, you know, it's very significant that, like, it's not just that Jesus was whipped and tortured and, you know, crucified and humiliated and all that. At the very end, you know, he says, Father, why have you forsaken me? And so now God knows what it feels like to be abandoned by God. And I think that affected a reconciliation between God and man. It wasn't quite possible for it. Healed that rift in a way because, you know, because God could say, like, I've gone through this with you, and it's the best I can do. And I have a new understanding of what it's like for you, for you people to go through this world I've created. And it changed God's relationship to mankind. And I really like that version of the story.
Well, I mean, we started this series off talking about True Detective, and by the last episode, I've realized that Russ's story pretty much parallels the story of the Old Testament.
But who listens to my podcast knows that staying on topic is not my strong suit.
Well,
No,
there's
no, no,
nothing
no.
wrong. There's nothing wrong with the 90-minute introduction to this episode, which is what we just did. I wasn't being sarcastic. There is nothing wrong with, because what we've done is in this introductory period here, we've really gone at the grander themes and their extensions of the series, and really looked at it in a grand sense. And now we can. I do think, for the purposes of being somewhat, like consistent with what we've done in the previous episodes, we should break down the episode and now get into the micro of it, like take these ideas we've been talking about and hang them on the moments that they exist within this episode, because I think they do. I think that was very relevant, the things that we've been kicking around here.
Hey, Steve here. I'm just going to jump in for a minute to say that this is the end of the first part of this 2-part conversation with Darryl Cooper of the Martyr Made History Podcast. Links to Darryl's show can be found in the show notes. I also just want to say that if you like what you hear, you can go over to beyondthebigscreen.com to find show notes, and then how to follow us on social media. You can go over to Facebook and search for A2Z History Page to find the page, and we have a group as well. We are also on YouTube at A2Z History, where you can listen to or watch our shorts, which are really fun and a lot of interesting content there. So definitely let us know what you think of this series, and we will see you in the next episode, where Frank and Mustache Chris and Darryl Cooper will wrap up True Detective